this video, I'm going to be talking about 6 fantasy world building mistakes that almost every new writer makes. And I know that because I've seen tons of new writers submit samples from their novels to me for my story coaching program, and I've also worked with a lot of those writers in my story coaching program as well. So these mistakes I'm about to cover in this video come from just seeing repeated patterns and repeated errors in a lot of these new writers' manuscripts. And they also come from lessons that I've learned along my own writing journey of publishing 3 fantasy books and a video game. Mistake number 1 is detaching your world building from your plot, characters, and theme. So, it's very tempting when you're starting out as a fantasy writer to just try to create the coolest fantasy world you possibly can. You throw in an amazing magic system, maybe you include some really interesting plants and animals, maybe you throw in this interesting political system as well, and you change some things about the geography, maybe you have some things floating in the sky, maybe you have oceans that are made from lava or something like that. And it's really easy to get carried away by adding all these cool elements, while forgetting that they probably aren't achieving a good story. Ultimately, world building is a tool for crafting good stories, and you should look at it that way. Does world building aid my story, or is it detracting from my story instead? And more specifically, is that world building integral and unified and coherent with my plot and my characters and my themes? The way to conceptualize this is that you want to create such a sense of coherence between the world that your characters inhabit, the characters themselves, and the actual plot, the kind of structure and movement of your story. You want to create such a sense of coherence between those 3 elements that it would almost feel impossible to remove one of those elements and put it in a different story. So ideally, you want to create a world that is so integral to your plot, to the struggles that your characters face, to the characters' arcs, that you couldn't easily remove those characters from that world and put them in a different setting. I think a story that does this to a incredible 10 out of 10 level for me is The Gutter Prayer by Gareth Ryder Hanrahan. This story is set in Gurdon, this very dark, grim, alchemical city that is almost like this sort of Victorian era, Glasgow-esque industrial city, but set in this sort of 19th century fantasy world. And it's a city where you have simultaneously like gods and monsters that are roaming around. You have ghouls beneath the city who are trying to control things. You have an alchemical guild that is trying to cook up these tallow men, which are these creatures made from molten wax who are basically like the Terminator and Terminator 2, just these like molten wax creatures trying to hunt down people. And you have all of these different kind of twisted monsters and people who want to control this city clashing into each other in a city that feels kind of almost like a fantasy version of Gotham. And that setting is so integral to the story that the author literally begins with the first chapter being narrated from the perspective of a building. And without getting into any specific spoilers for this story, the kind of spirit of the city is so integral to the plot as we follow along with these thieves who get caught up in these various political machinations throughout the story, to the point where that story is just such a great unified synthesis of character and plot and theme and world building. So the question to ask yourself here for this point is, how does this world building express my theme of my story? I've talked about theme a lot in previous videos on this channel, but essentially the way I kind of think about theme is that it is a moral question that is being asked through your story. So if you have a story which is all about spies and all about characters kind of betraying each other, trying to find the truth, trying to uncover lies, how can you craft a world that explores that theme to the fullest extent? You probably don't want to create a world that is really like kind of bright and breezy and happy and, you know, it's everyone is getting along great and that sort of thing. You probably want to create a world that is dark and twisted, where you never really know for sure what is happening, and there are always creatures lurking in the shadows, and there are all these political games going on behind the scenes. Maybe you even want to go as far as making some of the weather unpredictable, so that you don't know who to trust. You don't know which people to trust in this world, you don't know how to trust the weather in this world, you don't know how to trust the geography of this landscape even. It's really fun to kind of take your story's theme and to figure out interesting ways to sort of build like this symbolic web that you are exploring through the physical setting and landscape of your story. Likewise, it's really important to look at the interconnectedness between character and world as well. Ideally, you want to create the kind of world that is the most uniquely challenging to your main characters. You want your main characters to struggle as much as possible. So you should try to create a world that facilitates that struggle, that forces the character to question their beliefs, to undergo painful growth, and to experience some sort of character arc where they change over the course of their story and through the course of pursuing their desires. In this regard, The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan is a fantastic example of the synthesis between character and world building. In The Dark Knight, Bruce Wayne / Batman is extremely obsessed with trying to save the soul of Gotham from the Joker. However, the world building of Gotham and the kind of incentives that are operating in that world, the personalities of the people existing in this city, and the psychology of its inhabitants make it extremely difficult for Batman to actually save these people in the first place. So really, when it comes to this point, you should think about character, plot, and world building as 3 points on a triangle, and you should be always considering how the stuff you're doing here, whether it's in the world building, whether it's in the character, whether it's in the plot, how does that stuff actually relate to the other 2 points of that triangle? Mistake number 2 with fantasy world building is starting too big, particularly when you're beginning as an author and you are tasked with this challenge of trying to develop a fantasy world for your story. It can be overwhelming, and you can start to think, my gosh, I need to know everything about this world. I need to know the 20 rulers that have controlled this country. I need to know when this country was founded. I need to know how this universe was created, what gods were involved in that. I need to know the magic that is involved in every corner of the world. I need to know the city names in every corner of this world. And as you can see, it can get really overwhelming and really intimidating pretty quickly. However, I would almost recommend that you should try to step back from that. And instead of forcing yourself to take on such a big challenge, try to just look at your world building through a smaller lens. In our own lives, we understand very small aspects of the world around us. Like, there are so many things about the world that I have absolutely no clue about, but it really doesn't affect my life in a meaningful way. And because your world in your fantasy story is always going to be seen through the eyes of your characters, you can kind of take the same approach to that as well. You don't need to answer all the questions. You don't need to have every single aspect of your world building sorted out in advance. You know, we're not trying to be Tolkien here. We don't have to spend 20 years developing unique language systems and writing thousands and thousands of pages of history to develop your fantasy world. You absolutely can if you want to, but that can also lead to world builder's disease, which is when you just spend so much time developing your world that you never actually get on with the really important task of writing the actual story. So don't feel the pressure to start too big. And then also on a more kind of tactical, actionable level when it comes to actually writing your story. Within the novel itself, I would advise almost keeping yourself confined to a small lens on the world when you're starting out. It's very overwhelming for readers if you just throw them straight into this world and you are trying to bring them up to speed with literally everything in it. And this is what often leads to info dumping, which is where, you know, you get into a new fantasy book and you're like, okay, what's this about? And then within the first 20 pages, it's just this massive expositional prologue where the author is trying to throw every single thing at you. The author is like, I've done so much homework, I've done so much preparation on this world. You need to understand every single aspect of it. And that's quite overwhelming for readers to encounter. Instead, there is absolutely nothing wrong with confining yourself to a smaller, more manageable sense of world building. Again, world building is a tool for telling better stories. You don't get points for having the best world building. You get points for writing the best story. And that brings me to my next world building mistake, which is going shallow instead of deep. So this is kind of similar to the previous point I was just talking about the mistake of starting too big. But essentially what I'm saying here is that if you want to think about fantasy world building in terms of, let's say, like 15 or 20 different categories, whether they are things like currencies or languages or geography or magic, there's tons of other ways that you can kind of categorize and think about world building as well. When you're thinking about all these different categories of world building, it's very tempting to be like, okay, I've got to answer stuff for every single one of these. But quite often, if you try to cover all of these different aspects in your book, it will lead to shallow world building instead of deep world building. So, you know, you're gonna have a few sentences on each of these things, but because you're actually not going in depth into any of them, the reader's credibility and believability in the realism of this world is never quite going to be there. Instead, if you pick one or two of these aspects, so let's say I pick my magic system, and I also pick the geography of my world, and I just go really deep into exploring those in a fascinating, interesting, and hopefully original way that also serves my characters, my plot, and my theme. That is going to be far more interesting to readers because they're like, oh great, I love stories with well worked out magic and interesting takes on geography. This is exactly what I'm up for. Plus, as a side benefit to that, if you go really deep into one or two aspects of your world building and you fully convince readers that you have really thought out all the nuances and all the possibilities and implications of that specific subject, then when you offhandedly mention something about currency or languages, but you never actually go deep into it, the reader will just think, hang on a second, this author put a ton of effort into the magic and the geography. It felt really worked out. It felt very realistic to me. Okay, he's only mentioning this thing briefly, but I'm just going to assume that he's done the same amount of work for this thing. I'm going to assume that because he proved his credibility to me with this other aspect, I have just transferred that credibility over to this other aspect as well. And really, that's all readers want. Readers want the illusion that you have created this fully fledged world for them. In the same way, when you go to a theme park and you kind of know when you're at a theme park that everything is just a facade, but you want to be immersed, you want to be fooled, you want to believe the lie that this is a completely different world that you're stepping into with all of the rules and all of the implications thought out by a master designer. Before I get into the fourth mistake, I want to quickly tell you about my free fantasy writing advice ebook. 5 storytelling lessons that transformed my writing. You can download it for free by going to the link in the description down below, and it has exactly what it says on the tin. Some of the best lessons that I have learned from my 10 years of writing my various books and the video game that came out last year as well. And there have already been hundreds of writers that have downloaded and enjoyed the book, so go ahead and join them. Click the link in the description down below to get that now. Like I said, it's totally free. Fantasy world building mistake number 4 is ignoring the consequences. Often in our quest to develop really cool fantasy worlds, we can be a little bit flimsy about the consequences of what our world building would actually do. To use an example from one of my early books, which is currently unpublished, the book is called Masks of Steel, and it's basically set in this world where civilization lives on these sort of rocky spires that rise up from this sea of mist that is filled with monsters. And in this world, there are fighter pilots who fly planes around between these small rocky spires, get into dogfights with the pirates who are always trying to destroy this civilization. And basically, it's kind of Top Gun in this fantasy setting. Now, that was a really cool idea when I was writing it, and I was like, oh yeah, this is really interesting to explore. But in hindsight, there's a lot of consequences that I failed to adequately explore in that story. And if I eventually decide to go back to that novel, pick it up and publish it, these are all things I would have to fix. The most glaring one is, okay, if you have these really densely cities that are just sitting on top of these spires, first of all, where are they getting all these building materials from, especially for things like the planes? And then second of all, where are they growing all their food? Because you're constantly describing these spires as being like 90% occupied by buildings, like this very densely occupied city is on top of these rocky spires. Where's all like the farms and the food and that sort of thing? So not considering something like that is something that will probably strain the believability of the reader, and it's going to ruin their suspension of disbelief. So just off the top of my head, if I was thinking about a problem like that, the way I would maybe solve it is by saying, okay, well maybe somehow the food grows on the side of the spires, maybe they have some more efficient farming mechanism, maybe people in this world are actually magically adapted to not need as much food, maybe there's different spires that are just for farming. So you can actually figure out a way to work around these, but the important thing is you should always be looking to the consequences of your world building, because whenever you're changing something that's different from our world, there are first order, second order, third order, fourth order, and so on effects of how that can actually create these domino impacts on the ecology and the society of your world. For example, if you have a story setting where everyone in this world is like a Viking warrior or whatever, and they all go off to raid, who's staying behind to mind the farms and mind the animals and actually, mind the buildings and that sort of thing? So whenever you make a big change from our world in your own fantasy world building or setting, make sure you're always questioning what could be the potential impacts of this. And I think this is a step where it's really good to actually run your world building past, a couple of friends and basically just ask them to say, I want you to grill me on this. I want you to just try to poke out all the flaws and all the holes in this thing. Of course, your world building doesn't have to be a strictly logical exercise. There's times where it's totally fine to just follow the rule of cool and to have something in your world that doesn't really make sense, but you have it there anyway. For example, in Across the Broken Stars, which is set on these discs that float in space that are sort of surrounded by force fields, I wanted these characters who were called angels who could basically fly between the discs with wings. And of course, if you're in space, there's not really any air, but I was like, space fantasy, I want them to be able to fly with wings. I'm just gonna kind of hand wave my way out of this problem. And that's fine as well if you're being honest with your intentions and you are kind of creating that tone and that promise to readers. Fantasy worldbuilding mistake number 5 is anachronistic dialogue. So anachronistic simply means out of place or feeling like it is not correctly of this era. This is a very, very common thing that I have seen with the books that I've edited through my story coaching program. There are a lot of instances where, my clients are writing books that are set in sort of medieval-esque fantasy worlds, or sometimes a era that is maybe a little bit later, but they use dialogue that is sometimes far too modern. Sometimes they use things like, I gotta go, and just modern American slang that feels really at odds within this sort of fantasy world. It's very important to make sure that your dialogue feels congruent with your setting. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to come along and, do some really weird mock Shakespearean dialogue like saying, "Oh, I doth methinks that this griffin be attacking us," or I don't know, however people spoke in Shakespeare. You don't have to go to that extreme, but you do have to consider, is the way that this person is talking appropriate to this setting and to the voice and tone of this world that I'm trying to create? Really, what you just need to do here is avoid knocking readers out of their suspension of disbelief. With this as well, you also want to think about words and phrases that are kind of unique to our world that you might be taking for granted that wouldn't make sense in this fantasy setting. A very common instance of this is talking about things like minutes or hours. If you actually go back even a couple of hundred years, those were not really concepts that were super talked about. Our whole language around time and minutes and hours and this sort of thing only really came about once we started industrializing, at least in sort of the Western world, only came about when we started industrializing and all of a sudden, okay, we need to make sure that people are at the factory at the same chronological instance. So what do we need to do? We need to create time. But if you are just some farmer in 1500s England, there's no real need for you to understand minutes and hours because your day just consists of getting up when the sun gets up, working at your family's fields, and then going to sleep. And then lastly, mistake number 6 is a lack of originality and newness. So this is a bit more of an ephemeral point than the other things I've made here, but I truly believe that you should be striving to create a one-of-a-kind book every time you write something. You never just want to be a copy of a copy of a copy because there are a lot of things out there that are exactly like that. I think it's always so important when you're approaching your fantasy world building and your story in general to always strive to be putting something new into the genre, to be advancing the fantasy genre forward in some way, shape, or form. And the way that you do that, in my opinion, is you kind of look at the things that you are uniquely interested and influenced by, and you figure out a way to take them into your story. And hopefully your unique interests and hobbies and passions and the things that you are just curious about are going to be exactly that. They're going to be unique to you. So for example, maybe you're really into like fungi and mushrooms and that sort of thing. And you're just like, okay, how do I bring this into my fantasy world in a way that uses all of my specific knowledge and interests and curiosity from this weird sort of passionate hobby thing I have in a way that no other writer has done before because no other writer shares my passion in this thing. For me personally, like some of the stuff I'm really passionate about outside of fantasy stories include architecture. I used to work in the field of architecture and climbing. I'm a massive bouldering addict. So these are two things that, when I'm writing fantasy stories, I'm like, okay, how do I kind of develop really interesting architectural settings, such as in Kingdom of Dragons, the book I'm writing right now. Most of that story is set at this floating mountain city in the sky where there are all these warrens of tunnels that kind of carve through this floating mountain. There are these crystal doorways that open up when you touch these sort of combination locks made from jewels next to them. And there is all this other sort of magic infused into that setting as well. And I could really just run wild with the interior design of a lot of these rooms too. I'm not saying I'm the only writer who is interested in architecture here or anything, but because it's something that I'm very passionate about, hopefully I'm able to present a slightly unique or original take on it when I'm writing about it in my books. And I think that's what you should be striving for as well. Every time you are developing a world or writing a story, you should be asking yourself, how do I infuse some of my soul into this? How do I make something that really can't be compared with anything else that is out there because it is such a unique expression of what I am interested in. It's definitely easier said than done, but it is an ambition that I think we should all strive towards when we are writing fantasy stories. And for those of you who are with me on the path of pursuing original world building that also manages to express your characters and your plots and your themes in a cohesive and resonant way, to you I say, keep writing, keep striving. I'll see you in the next video.